Hey everyone, someone asked a conservative televangelist what they thought about why Jesus never talked about LGBTQ lifestyle. You know, I have a problem with that word, but anyway, we're going to roll with it. Check out what he had to say.
Question for you from Michelle. Why did Jesus not speak on the LGBTQ lifestyle? I read Romans and other books. So many youth are struggling with this. Yeah, let me talk to this. Yeah, a lot of young people are struggling with this, and I find it really interesting that when I was a kid, not many young people were struggling with this.
Not that you knew of.
Certainly some, but not many. And I don't know that we have the time or the scope to investigate all the reasons as to why that is. That today it's more of a phenomenon. If you say it has nothing to do with social media, you're lying.
Sure.
Lying.
You have rocks in your head. Of course it does. Of course it has to do with
Rocks in your
encouragement
head.
and influence.
Oh my
And
gosh.
curiosity and some of that. And some factors I'm sure that we don't know anything about.
Okay, so I looked it up. John Bradshaw was born in the late 60s, mid to late 60s. So when he was growing up, we're talking about the 70s, maybe early 80s. So let's talk about what things were like back then. Virtually anywhere, people could discriminate against you if you were out as an LGBTQ person. They could throw you out of their business at any time for any moment. They could refuse to do service with you at any time for any moment. Your spouse could sue you for a divorce and take full custody of your children, and you would never see them again. Your employer could fire you for no other reason that you were out and LGBTQ, and you would lose your means of survival, of paying for yourself. And not only could this happen, this did happen all the time. All the time. Not to mention housing discrimination. People wouldn't want you to live in their place if they found out about it. So we're talking about the basic things you need to survive. A job, a way to pay your bills, a place to live, food to eat. These were things that could be denied to you if you were LGBTQ. The basics that you needed to live. Not to mention that the one place where people had to gather, the gay bars, were constantly being raided by police who were physically assaulting gay men and raping gay women, and then putting your name and then putting you in jail, and your name would be in the paper the next day, and all of those things that I just talked about would happen to you because everybody would know. You would lose your spouse, you would lose your children, you would lose your housing, you would lose your job, and this happened to so many people. Not to mention, I think the last lobotomy was performed on someone for being LGBT in the 60s, and electroshock therapy and aversion, all kinds of things were happening. So of course, would you expect people to be out in that kind of environment? Or would you expect for them to hide with everything they were? I mean, you would expect for them to hide. So the implication that, well, who knows, what these other reasons are. I mean, we could investigate them. He ought to know based on when he grew up. He ought to know what was happening. He ought to be aware of these things. And this kind of statement that if anyone says it doesn't have to be to do with social media, they have rocks in their head or they're lying to you. Any idea that exists today is on social media. That is the way of communicating. I found his video on social media. You are watching this on social media. This is how these things happen. It's the internet is how these things happen. The idea that people are becoming gay because TikTok is making them gay. I don't know what is going after here, but this is really not a very good way to frame this.
Michelle, Jesus did speak about the LGBTQ lifestyle, but he spoke about the LGBTQ I, as in, I know I is for intersex today, but I for immorality, and P for pervert, and U
So
for
disrespectful.
unfaithful,
Oh my gosh.
and A for adultery. He spoke about all of that. What Jesus emphasized was sexual purity
Calling
and
people
moral
perverts.
purity, and he emphasized that that sexual relationships should take place within the confines of marriage. And you understand, don't you, that children, now someone's going to think I'm being critical. I'm not. If you knew my broader family, you'd understand I'm not. The facts are children born into two-parent households do better on every level by every measure.
Mm-hmm.
Just for the record, this is research that was done between male-female couples versus single mothers. Like, this is a robust finding. It's better to have a two-parent household than to be a single parent. That's pretty obvious, though, right?
I'm from, and again, I want you to hear me with some grace, even though someone's going to think I'm not being gracious. When it became much easier for women to have children without there being a husband in the picture, then it just started to happen more and more and more. Men
What's he talking about?
abdicated their responsibilities. That's a crime in the eyes of God. So many kids being born as a result of lust, and a man who once upon a time would have made an honest woman out of her just left.
Yes.
And just said, this is not my concern, you take care of that. And so there's a woman somewhere doing her very best to raise a child, and she's got to be the mother and the father. She's got to be in two places at once. She's got to work and raise a kid, and how can she go to the game and help with homework and all of that? You understand, I'm not speaking against women who find themselves in that situation. I'm not. I'm talking against a societal trend that has just left kids to flounder because they're not allowing them to be raised in the comfort and the security and the providence of a two-parent household.
What does this have to do with LGBTQ people? I don't know. He's going to try to make that connection in a moment. But I guess what he means, I mean, he says he's not blaming the woman at all, but I guess what he means by when women were able to, have a child without a man, I guess he's meaning having like the ability to get a job, the ability to have access to credit, just things like that, like just the ability to survive without being attached to a man. That does seem to be blaming actually women to me. That they kind of chose this. I feel like he could have gone a lot of different directions with this. I mean, if you really look at some of the underlying causes of single mothers who don't have any support from the child's father, not an LGBTQ problem, by the way. But if you look at some of the underlying factors, we're talking about things like poverty, things like mass incarceration, which of course disproportionately affects Black and brown people. And we're also talking about welfare laws that are structured in such a way to disincentivize marriage. So, he could have talked about any of those things as potential reasons why this is happening and wanting to attack that instead of blaming it on lust and immorality. And I think this is part of the reason why Christianity doesn't do more good in the world. It's because it too often just blames people instead of looking at like how to make people's lives better. Hey, talking about these things is great and very important. One organization that has been pioneering this kind of work for over 40 years is Seventh-day Adventist Kinship International. They have conferences, they have resources, YouTube channel. You can become a member. They have groups. They have all kinds of support. Check them out in my description below.
So there's just so much in the Bible that God speaks against on a moral level. He's against it all the stuff that tends to cheapen and lessen marriage and depower the home, and society is built on the home. So you wonder, why didn't he speak about this lifestyle? He did. He spoke against all sexual behavior, moral behavior that falls outside the will of God. He did speak to it, just not as specifically as you'd like.
Not as specifically as he liked means he didn't speak to it at all. He's trying to apply things that had nothing to do with people asking to get into the institution of marriage and same-sex couples, like nothing to do with that. And he's applying it to that. So not as specifically as you'd like means he didn't talk about it actually at all.
People often think that the situations of this nature that we're going through in this day and age in this culture, that it's something new, it's
right.
something different. It's like, oh, well, yeah, that was the things that Jesus said were for then, but this is now, and times are different. But really, they're not different. Morality, purity, innocence, those types of things are still applicable today. The things that
He's saying that morality, purity, and innocence are not available to LGBTQ people, or people who are pursuing a same-sex marriage. Can't be those things. They're apparently immoral, impure.
sometimes people want to dismiss the teachings of Jesus, thinking that they're outdated, but really they ring true in this generation, probably even more so than previous generations.
And what he spoke to in that day.
Yes.
I mean, Jesus was raised in the Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. I quoted not long ago from a researcher from, I think, James Madison University, who said that immorality was a foreign concept to the Romans. They were some earthy people.
Right.
And it were no holds barred.
Immorality was foreign to them because anything went. There was no restraint.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I don't think we need to pretend that the sorts of things we're dealing with today just didn't happen in Jesus' day.
Sure.
From a moral perspective, however you want to classify that.
Or that's some new thing that requires a new set of rules or principles. What Jesus said is very applicable to today.
Okay, so he said people want to somehow say that what Jesus said was outdated. Those who want to carefully consider cultural context, the context into just what Jesus was speaking and the concerns that his original audience had, are not just saying the Bible is outdated. They're saying, look, this Bible is 2,000 years old, and it was answering questions that people asked 2,000 years ago. And we need to carefully consider that context when we interpret it, and not just pretend like nothing has changed in the last 2,000 years. So they quoted from an undergraduate journal to say that there is no such thing as morality in the Roman Empire. Actually, if you read the rest of the quote, you'd realize that what they went on to say wasn't even compatible with that quote. But in understanding the sexuality in the Greek and Roman Empire, I've relied largely on the work of Marilyn Skinner, who is like one of the preeminent experts in the field of Greek and Roman sexuality. And others agree with her on this in what she has to say. And they certainly would not say that Romans in the time of Jesus had no sense of morality. The dominant philosophy in Rome, the popular philosophy in Rome at the time, was Stoicism. And if you know anything about Stoicism, which a lot of people do, you know it was largely structured around the commitments that people had to one another, and largely structured around doing the right thing within the right context and having restraint and not stepping beyond what you were supposed to do. Romans had a very strong system of understanding of what was right and wrong sexually and morally, but it was dramatically different than our own. It was more based off dominance and submission and who had power, and they were supposed to use that power benevolently, and who did not have power and who had shame within society. And there was a lot of exploitation that went on. There was a lot of violence within the system, but there was a system. It was a very strong system, and it had very strong rules. They were very different from our own. But what no scholar today will tell you, any of the preeminent scholars in this field, none of them will tell you that not Greek, because this wasn't Greece, this was Rome, that the Roman ideas in the first century, in the early imperial period of Rome, none of them will tell you that they had ideas about sexuality that were the same as our ideas about sexual orientation. They didn't. And so the scholars won't tell you that. Like, it was very different. And was there same-sex marriage? No. And Jesus wasn't even in Rome. Jesus spent his whole life in Israel and in Galilee and in Samaria. The idea that Jesus would have somehow come across, or that his audience would in any way be interested in questions about same-sex marriage because of what was happening in Rome, when it wasn't even happening in Rome, it's ludicrous. So no, things in Jesus' day were not the same as they are now. And it is not saying the Bible's outdated to say that we should carefully consider that. Consider the fact that maybe there's a reason why Jesus never addressed an issue that you know he would address if he was around today, like he would have. Anywho, let's see what he has to say next.
So this, if you identify as LGBTQI or something else, God bless you. I mean, this isn't the forum for me to oppose that. What I mean to say is, someone's not going to like that.
Yeah.
What I mean to say is this. You can be whatever you feel like being, whatever you believe you are, however you identify. But at the same time, allow God to work in your life. There are many, many people who have said, as a male, I'm not attracted to females, but they kept themselves pure. As a female, I'm not attracted to males. So they didn't get married, and they lived a life of purity, a life of abstinence. Now that just sounds like too heavy a cross for some people to carry.
Okay, so I am actually really happy to hear a lot of what he just said. And I find it refreshingly surprising, actually, in his context and considering the larger perspective of what he believes. I think it's a great thing that he is acknowledging that there are people who experience their lives this way and that you could be celibate. He's not saying you can become straight or that you should marry someone of the other gender. He seems to even be saying that you can be honest about who you are. You can be LGBTQ and pursue pursue a holy life. Like, wow, like I think that's some progress. He says a little bit more. I'm just going to go back for a moment because I want to talk about this cross to bear stuff that he said.
Male, I'm not attracted to males. So they didn't get married, and they lived a life of purity, a life of abstinence. Now that just sounds like too heavy a cross for some people to carry. Well, I mean, you do you, but then there's a judgment to look forward to, and you want to live under the smile of God and in the blessing of God. So all moral behavior that falls outside the will of God is outside the will of God. Mm-hmm. But you got to know that however you believe you are wired or made, God is able to keep you in the center of his will and guide you in a pathway that honors him. That's really important.
Okay, so he spoke about having your cross that you have to bear. That's your cross that you have to bear. I find this interesting because this is something I've been thinking about. And you might be surprised to hear me say this because I am definitely pro-affirming theology, affirming same-sex marriage and transgender identity. So you might be surprised to hear me say this, but sometimes I think that the most important kind of dividing line in this conversation isn't as much about whether you are affirming or whether you believe the accepted theology in most conservative churches. Sometimes I think the most important dividing line actually is whether you look at LGBTQ people and the difficulties that they have, that we have, and whether you say that is your cross to bear or whether you say, I'm going to take responsibility for trying to do something about this. I am going to do my best. If you believe that people should be celibate, I'm going to do what I can to make sure you have a meaningful life, to make sure that you maybe live a life of celibacy, but not a life of being alone, to make sure that you have a family, people to go on to vacations with, that you're involved in the lives of children, that you have places that you can go and spend time with others. Like, I'm going to be part of making that happen for you. I'm not going to just say, that's your burden to bear. I'm going to be there with you to shoulder that as well every step of the way and to find joy in that life. So there are those who do that. And then there are those who say it's your burden to bear. And whenever I hear people saying it's just their burden to bear, and I'm not even saying John Bradshaw is saying this, but whenever I do hear people say that, it reminds me a little bit of what Pilate did in washing his hands. I mean, that's literally what Pilate did. He washed his hands. It's not my problem. And he sent Jesus off to be crucified. That's what people are doing. They're saying, well, this is your burden to bear. You go be crucified. It's not my thing. Huge problem. Huge problem. And then the one last point that I want to make is he talked about you want to live under the smile of God. And some people are really afraid to accept affirming theology because they're afraid that they won't be living under the smile of God if they do. Look, God delights in you and loves you and smiles at you, whether you get things right or wrong, because you're God's child. He doesn't smile on you when you're correct and frown on you when you're wrong. Like, it's okay. It would be really nice to see affirming theology acknowledged. Maybe if he doesn't agree with it, at least as a sincere choice, a sincere belief in a lot of people that this is actually within the will of God and what God wants to see. And that in many ways, gay people are there to test the straight people in the church to see if they can accept and care about people who are different than themselves, to that trans people are a gift to the church, to see if the church can really embody the love of Christ to those people. And I would just like to see that acknowledged as a possibility, that there are many of us who want to faithfully follow God through affirming theology. So, Anyway, thank you so much for watching. And remember, God smiles on you because you are God's child and God's creation. And that does not change if you get something wrong. So let's try to dial down the insecurity and the fear and trust in what we know about the character of God and who God is and the love of God. And it's going to be okay. So thank you for being here with me on this journey on this channel. I am really enjoying myself. And if you enjoy and appreciate this content, do not forget to subscribe and click that bell for notifications as well. So thank you for being here, and I will see you soon.